It's been a week. It's been a week. I found myself in all kinds of places this week. I found myself in hospital rooms with people you know. I said goodbye to a dear friend on Monday. Some of you know I'm in a book group, and we read these heady books that once in a while poor Elaine has to listen to in the car. I was with Keith. Didn't have the surgery he wanted to have. But in that dark moment, there were these 3 angels he calls his sister and his 2 daughters. Elaine and I, for Thanksgiving, went over to Kalamazoo, and we were with her son John and his wife Paula's family. Paula is one of 7. She has 6 siblings. 5 of the siblings were there. And they stood in the kitchen, hand in hand. There was about, 20, 25 of us with the kids and everybody. And the matriarch offered the Thanksgiving prayer. And there was a moment in the midst of that joyful, warm, Thanksgiving circle of love of remembering who wasn't there. The patriarch. And then we said thanks to God, and a feast was had. While we were in Kalamazoo, we went to see Carlos Zelton. Carlos is a member of this congregation. He's a junior at Western. He's kind of Elaine's and my surrogate grandson. We decided it was time to see, what does that apartment look like that I've been co-signing for 2 years? And that young man, who's been a member of this church, or has been in this church for 7 years, sat and talked to us about being a cadet with the Battle Creek Police. And this is a young man who sits as a cadet. He sits with students from the high school who've gotten themselves into a little bit of trouble. That happens to some kids in high school. Anybody here get in trouble in high school? Oh, I see a couple of hands, yes. Most of you are just goody two-shoes, I know. But think about this. Carlos is sitting there with students who've gotten themselves in trouble, and the parents are there. And he says, sometimes, I have parents that don't care. And he said, that's really hard. But he says, I look at the student and I say to them, you do not want to go to juvie. And they sit there like, yeah, right. Yeah, you, Mr. Cadet Policeman. And he says, yeah, I've been to juvie. Carlos can say that. He went to juvie as a little guy. And he says, I know what that dark path looks like. You do not want to go there. Make a different choice. Carlos is not a great big guy. He's already been thrown against a wall and a window. But to see the spark in his eyes, he wants to be in these conversations. He wants to be there to help people when they get in trouble. He wants to be a light in the darkness for people. And let me tell you, this is amazing, because this guy made a lot of mistakes in high school. Elaine and I sat with him and scratched our heads and said, what are you thinking? And he looks back at it and he goes, what was I thinking? Because now he gets it. Now, what happened between 17 and 21, I'm not sure. But a lot happened for him. On Friday morning, the phone rang at 6 a.m. And Ruth Beersdorf, who is just in the start of a new trial of cancer treatments at Carmanos, she started on Tuesday, needed to go to emergency. So I took her. And while we waited for 4 hours for somebody to do a very simple procedure she needed to have done, we made phone calls. She made phone calls and I made phone calls because she needed to get to an appointment at Carmanos in the afternoon. And in the midst of that darkness, someone said yes, and she got to her appointment. And then Mr. Ed and I got in the car and went to the memorial for Ian Kenosha, who was a member of this church for over 20 years. And we listened to stories. Stories of a real person who was sometimes impatient. Anybody else impatient out there? Yes, there you are. But he was also generous and giving. And he was a good cook, too. I didn't get to eat his cooking, but I hear stories. He was a fabulous cook. Stories were told about how maybe he wasn't always gushy and warm and fuzzy, but there were moments when he let you know you were important. Darkness and light. Darkness and light. So, this text is pretty rough, isn't it? Pretty rough text. So I have a confession to make. You probably never have heard this text before. Anybody ever remember hearing this text before? Yeah, you have. Because once upon a time you had a preacher who actually preached the lectionary. True confession. I have not preached the lectionary much since I've been here in Advent, because these texts are really super hard. And because the church has mostly made these texts about Jesus coming back and magically fixing all things. And really and truly, we need to live right now and not just go, okay, let's let Jesus come now and fix it, and then we can just sit here and wait. That's not what this text says. As you do all this, you know what time it is. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your sleep. Now our salvation is nearer than when we first had faith. So what are we talking about? We're talking about living in the darkness, recognizing that darkness isn't something that just happens now. Every era in history, every moment of our lives has times of darkness. But what this text is saying is, don't miss the light. The reason the title of the sermon is Nearer Now Than Ever is that we have the longevity to know that the darkness of this moment isn't all there is. The light is still there, breaking through in the midst of dark situations. And this is our heartache with our teenagers, isn't it? The rate of teenage suicide is higher than for any other age group. They haven't been alive long enough, and frankly haven't been in the faith in God long enough to know that there is another day. They think, this is it. I cannot survive this. My life is over. Now we know, whatever it is, whatever that darkness is, there is light enough to get you through it. But we have to find ways to hold that light out for one another, each other. We need to find ways to let our teens know this pain that you have, it doesn't have to be life-threatening in every darkness. We have to live into the light. And frankly, friends, that's a learned behavior. We have to learn that from each other, teach it to each other, share it with each other. One of the great pieces of literature says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Yes, darkness and depression and poverty and student debt and cancer, all of these and more are real. But light comes and breaks through in the midst of all that because there is friendship and community and neighbors and doctors and treatments and support groups and job training and hospice and counseling and prayer and singing and music and movies and art and comedy and sleep sometimes. Now our salvation is nearer than when we first had faith. How is salvation near? The text says that we are to use our weapons of light. I have trouble with weapons. But you know what? There is a discipline in seeing light that is military grade, meaning hard-wearing, tough, not easily broken. The discipline of seeing light even in the darkest moment. Now the rest of this passage is really hard to take, isn't it? It gets a little bit preachy, this Pauline lecture. But actually what it's saying is it's choosing what living in the light can look like. So I'm going to dumb it down to, you know what? We don't get to live in oblivion. We don't get to drink ourselves into a stupor so we can't feel the darkness. That won't show the light. And we also cannot just, selfishly indulge ourselves because we can, and that way we can ignore the darkness, because that's a false light. The text ends with, dress like Jesus. It doesn't say how, it just says dress like Jesus. Each of us have to choose what that looks like in our lives, to live in the light. Elaine and I went to see the movie Harriet yesterday morning. It's about Harriet Tubman. It's worth seeing. That's someone who saw a lot of darkness in the slavery that she experienced, the slavery that she saw, but she chose to walk in the light. She chose to be the hope in hopeless situations and to put herself in harm's way, to be the light against the darkness. Now, I know most of us are not going to be a Harriet Tubman. But I know each of you can be a spark of light in whatever the darkness is around you. And when the darkness around you threatens to put out your light, then you reach out to someone else in your life, in this community, and you look for the light from them to shine in your darkness. This is the whole point of having a church family, a community, a family of faith. May it be so among us.